The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was deafening. Li Yong squinted at his computer screen, half aware of the email notification pinging in the background. It was another one of those routine updates from the biotech lab where he worked, but there was something different about it. Maybe it was the bright red subject line, Trial Subject 4523, Activation Phase Completed. Proceed with enhancement. Maybe it was the sense of unease that had been gnawing at him for weeks, ever since he'd volunteered for the experimental gene editing trial. He rubbed his temples and sighed. For someone whose life had always been one big gray blur, work, sleep, more work, this was the kind of moment he wasn't sure he wanted to embrace. The world was changing around him, and he had no idea if he was about to leap forward or fall flat on his face. Li Yong's hand hovered above the mouse. He could feel a nervous flutter in his stomach, but his curiosity was stronger. Before he could think better of it, his finger clicked. He wasn't expecting much. He wasn't expecting anything really. Maybe a glitchy pop-up with a few lines of code. Or maybe, just maybe, something more. Seconds later, a small mechanical drone whizzed into his office, its sleek black body cutting through the sterile air like an insect. He blinked, startled. The drone carried a syringe filled with a glowing, almost translucent blue liquid. The sight of it made Li Yong's heart race. He stood up, still unsure whether to laugh or scream. "Mr. Li," came a voice from the intercom. His boss, Dr. Zhang, spoke with the usual calm, emotionless tone. "You are required to proceed with the final injection. The gene editing protocol requires immediate activation." Li Yong's mouth went dry. He had been chosen for this trial, he knew that. He had read the fine print. But this was real now. No more speculation, no more theoreticals. The serum was sitting in front of him, gleaming ominously in the drone's tiny robotic arm. His hand moved before he could stop it, grabbing the syringe from the drone and driving it into his arm. The liquid was cold, cold enough to make him flinch, but as soon as it entered his bloodstream, a wave of heat surged through his body. He felt a momentary dizziness, a brief blackening of his vision. But then it passed, as if his body had simply absorbed the alien substance, like it was supposed to be there all along. A few minutes passed. Nothing. Nothing but the low buzz of his office computer and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Li Yong rubbed his eyes, trying to focus. Something was off, but it was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was, and then, he blinked. The text on his computer screen was sharper than usual. In fact, it was so sharp that he could read individual letters on a far-off web page, a tiny news ticker scrolling across a distant monitor across the room. He squinted, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Wait, what? He turned his head toward the window. His vision sharpened even more, cutting through the haze of smog and pollution outside, until he could make out details he had never noticed before. He could see the individual dust particles floating in the air, suspended like little stars in the harsh light of day. He saw a pigeon on a rooftop half a mile away, the details of its feathers clearer than anything he'd ever seen in his life. The world had changed. Or maybe it was him who had changed. The room around him felt too small, too contained. He could hear every creak of the floorboards under his feet. The sound of his breathing, the tap of his fingers on the keyboard, it was all too sharp. Then there was the noise from the hallway. Footsteps. He could hear them, and they weren't even close. Someone was coming down the corridor outside his office. Their steps were distinct, each one louder than it had any right to be. His senses had gone from normal to hyper-alert in seconds. Li Yong turned to the door, suddenly aware of every movement, every vibration, every sound. A wave of panic crested in his chest. He had to get up. He had to leave. He needed to run. But why? The hallway door opened with a slight creak. Li Yong blinked, trying to calm his breathing. His mind raced, but it was as if something had taken over his body. He bolted to his feet, ignoring the logical part of his brain that screamed at him to calm down. The world felt too much, and then, he was running, his feet pounded against the polished floor, his legs pushing faster than they ever had before. The doors of the office building blurred around him, the walls merging into a tunnel of concrete and glass. Lee Yong didn't even think about it, he was already outside, sprinting down the street with no destination in mind. It felt good. It felt right that every step was faster than the last. His body was made for speed, each stride propelling him forward with the effortless grace of a cheetah. He could feel the wind rushing past his ears, the world turning into nothing but a blur of shapes and shadows. A voice in his head screamed to stop, to slow down. But it was too late. He was already caught up in the madness. He sprinted past people, pedestrians turning their heads to stare at him in confusion, but their faces barely registered in his peripheral vision. The speed was consuming him, filling him up, making everything else disappear. Time stretched and compressed, and Lee Yong, no, the man who was now something more than a man, pushed his body beyond its limits. He was like an animal, focused solely on the next step, the next burst of speed, the next release of energy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lee Yong slowed down. He found himself standing in the middle of a quiet park, breathless, disoriented. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't from exhaustion. It was from the rush that only an apex predator could feel. A part of him wanted to laugh. Another part of him felt like he was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. As his breathing slowed, he stood still, trying to force his mind back into some semblance of control. But he couldn't quite grasp it. He could hear the rustling of leaves overhead, the distant sound of children playing, the drone of traffic in the distance. He could hear it all, louder and clearer than he ever had before. Every sound was sharp. Every sensation was magnified, and that's when the next change happened. Lee Yong felt a strange pull in his muscles. He looked down at his arms, his hands. They were trembling slightly, but not from exhaustion. They were trembling from an odd sense of strength, a muscle tension that he hadn't felt before. It was as if his body was straining to do something, to act. Without thinking, he reached out toward a nearby bench. He grasped the edge, and before he could fully register it, he was lifting the entire bench off the ground. It was effortless, ridiculously effortless. The weight, which should have been too heavy for any normal person to lift, felt like a feather in his grip. Stop, he whispered under his breath, setting the bench back down, but it wasn't stopping. His body seemed to have a mind of its own. The animal inside him, whatever it was waking up. Lee Yong stood still, his hands still vibrating with the impossible weight of the bench he'd just lifted. The sensation of power pulsed through him like an electric current, rushing through his muscles, down into his legs and spine. It was as if his body had just awakened to something beyond human, something untamed. The world around him seemed to shrink as his senses expanded, and for a moment, he was overwhelmed with the urge to do something more, something greater. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stop. This wasn't right. It couldn't be right. This was a mistake, wasn't it? He hadn't signed up for this. Or maybe he had, in some half-conscious way, driven by his own desperation for something, anything, different in his life. But now that the change was real, now that he could feel the weight of it, the sheer power humming beneath his skin, he didn't know if he could control it. A sudden noise startled him out of his thoughts. A group of joggers rounded the corner of the park, their rhythmic footfalls punctuating the stillness. Without thinking, Lee Yong tensed, and his eagle-sharp eyes locked on them. Each jogger's motion was perfectly visible to him, each stride long and fluid, muscles flexing with precision. His eyes could track them in perfect detail, every movement like a slow-motion replay. He heard the pulse of their sneakers against the pavement, the soft, steady breath they took with each step. But it wasn't just the joggers he could hear, it was everything. The soft swish of the leaves overhead, the faint buzz of a far-off car engine, the murmur of voices from distant buildings. It was like every sound in the universe was coming at him at once, forcing him to listen, to absorb, to feel it all. His chest tightened. He could no longer ignore it. It was as if he were standing at the center of a storm, his mind struggling to filter out the noise, to keep from drowning in it. A runner passed too close to him. Li Yong flinched, the sudden proximity of the person snapping him out of his heightened state. He backed away, heart pounding, his body twitching with the desire to run, to keep moving, to release the tension that had built up in his muscles. The urge was insatiable. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His instincts screamed at him to chase, to catch up with the joggers, to outrun them, to become them. But he resisted. For the first time, he realized he wasn't sure if he had the ability to stop. Something snapped inside him. He needed to run. His legs surged forward without warning, propelling him into motion. The wind hit him with a force that was both familiar and new. This wasn't just running. This was a flood of energy surging through him, a power he couldn't have imagined before. His body moved too fast, too fluidly, his legs a blur beneath him as he tore across the park, past the jogging group, beyond the scattered benches, toward the horizon that beckoned him with unspoken promises. It wasn't until he hit the outskirts of the park and finally slowed to a stop that he could breathe again. His chest heaved as his heart hammered in his chest, and yet the pounding was no longer a sign of fatigue, it was the rapid fire of an instinct he couldn't contain. His body was on fire, alive with too much energy. He couldn't stop the wave of euphoria that washed over him. But this feeling wasn't freedom. It was chaos. He had pushed himself too far, too fast. He had just done something that should have been impossible. But here he was, standing still, on the edge of a cliff, with no idea what the next step was. Li Yong's hands shook as he tried to focus, tried to regain some semblance of control. It wasn't just his speed, no, it was something deeper. The power within him was coursing through his body, a primal, unrelenting force that he wasn't sure he was capable of mastering. It wasn't something he could just shut off. The ground beneath his feet felt too soft, too flimsy. He reached down and felt the grass, his fingers sinking into the soil. Instinctively, he lifted his hand. It wasn't just the strength he felt. It was a pressure, a deep, undeniable urge to do something. He could feel the weight of the earth, the weight of every object around him. His fingers twitched, and in an instant, the ground beneath his feet cracked. He froze, eyes wide in disbelief. The earth, his fingertips had just caused the earth to crack beneath him. Li Yong staggered back. His breath was shallow. His body was trembling. The force had been so sudden, so overwhelming, he couldn't even process it. "This isn't me," he whispered hoarsely. "This isn't me." His voice cracked with desperation, with confusion, but he couldn't deny it. He wasn't in control. Not anymore. He had become something else. Something other. The rest of the day passed in a blur of confusion and frustration. Li Yong tried to push the episode from his mind. He tried to focus on the simple things, the normal things, the human things that used to bring him comfort. But the feeling of the power inside him, he couldn't escape it. It was still there, gnawing at him, buzzing under his skin like a constant reminder that he was no longer just Li Yong, the quiet researcher. He was something else now. Something more. And it was impossible to ignore. That night, as he lay in his small apartment, Li Yong closed his eyes, hoping for sleep. But even in the quiet darkness, his senses never dulled. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the apartment building settling, the buzz of the streetlights outside. It was too much. He couldn't escape it. There was a knock on his door. It was so soft, so quiet, that for a moment he wasn't sure if it had even happened. He opened his eyes, his heart racing. This time, his body didn't freeze in confusion. No, it reacted instinctively, immediately. His feet moved, and he was at the door before he could even think about it. He didn't know why, but he opened it. There, standing in the dim hallway, was Dr. Lin. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. She stood with her arms crossed, as if she had known exactly how things would play out. "Li Yong," she said calmly, "I see it's begun." Li Yong stepped back instinctively, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected her to come, hadn't expected her to show up on his doorstep, of all places. He hadn't told anyone what had happened, not in detail. But the way she looked at him, the way her eyes seemed to size him up as if he were a problem to be solved, told him everything. It's already happening, isn't it? She asked, her voice measured. The strength, the speed, the senses. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. You're experiencing them all now. Aren't you? Li Yong didn't answer. How could he? The words were stuck in his throat, caught between fear and confusion. He nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. What did he even want to say? Dr. Lin studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke again, her voice softer now, almost sympathetic. I knew the initial stages would be overwhelming. But you need to understand this, you're not just a subject in an experiment anymore. You've become something different. Something that can't be easily controlled. Her words settled over him like a weight. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears. His hands clenched into fists as if they were ready to destroy something, anything. The animal inside him stirred, restless. You're losing yourself, she continued. You're no longer the man you were. The instincts will take over if you don't learn how to manage them. This isn't just about raw power. It's about balance. She paused, looking at him with a kind of pity in her eyes. If you don't learn control, you'll lose yourself completely. Li Yong swallowed hard. Her words felt like a final warning, like a bell tolling in the distance, calling him to face what he had become. But as he stood there in the dark, the weight of his new reality pressing down on him, one thought gnawed at him with growing urgency. Could he ever control this? Could he tame the beast inside him, or was it already too late? Li Yong didn't move. The hallway around him seemed to stretch, to warp in his vision as his mind raced, his senses too sharp, too alive. He wanted to lash out, to shout, to demand answers from Dr. Lin, but something in her calm, cold demeanor made him freeze. He didn't know how to handle this. Didn't know how to respond to the reality of what was happening to him. Dr. Lin stepped inside, not waiting for an invitation. The door clicked softly behind her. She didn't seem surprised by his stillness, but there was something calculating in her eyes, like she had expected this moment to come. You're more aware of it now, aren't you? Her voice was soft but direct, as if she were speaking to a child who had just discovered something unspeakably dangerous. The urges. The animal inside you. It's calling to you, Li Yong. And the more you fight it, the stronger it will get. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, the pulse of adrenaline crashing through his veins. The urge to do something, to act, was nearly overwhelming. His hands twitched, flexing involuntarily as he tried to hold on to something, anything to ground him. His eyes flicked toward the window, and he caught sight of a car parked across the street. The way it sat there, unmoving, so vulnerable. I could lift it, he thought. I could crush it with my bare hands. But the thought wasn't rational. It wasn't even his own. It was the animal side of him, the predatory instinct of a beast that had only just begun to stir. Stop thinking about it, Dr. Lin said, as if reading his mind. She moved to the kitchen counter, her voice unshaken by the intensity of his internal battle. The more you think about it, the more you'll give in. Focus, Li Yong. Control. Control. The word buzzed in his mind, but the idea of controlling this, of reigning in the chaos that was now running wild inside him, felt like trying to trap a storm in a jar. I didn't ask for this, he said, his voice rough. The words felt weak as soon as they left his lips, as if they were meaningless. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. His body had already crossed the line, and now it was pushing him towards something he wasn't ready to understand. Dr. Lin turned to him, and for the first time, Li Yong saw something akin to pity in her expression. No, you didn't ask for this. But this is what we've all been working for, Li Yong. You're the future. Every breakthrough we've made, the enhancements, the genetic modifications, they were meant to push the boundaries of human potential. But now that you've crossed over, you have to decide what you want to become. What I want, he echoed, unable to keep the disbelief from creeping into his voice. His hands clenched again, harder this time. The tremors in his fingers were becoming a constant, and as he flexed them, he felt a surge of strength that startled him. He could crush the chair in front of him, reduce it to splinters with a single motion. He could, no, Dr. Lin said sharply, cutting off his spiraling thoughts. You can't think like that. You can't act on those impulses. But how could he not? Everything inside him, every nerve, every cell, was screaming for release. His body felt too small, too contained. He wanted to tear through the walls, to shatter everything around him and run, just like earlier. To be something more than human, something free. The animal instincts are strong, she continued, her gaze hardening, but they won't last forever. The body can only sustain this level of heightened energy for so long before it burns out. The key is balance. And you need to find it before it consumes you. Li Yong's stomach twisted. The truth of what she was saying, how easily he could lose control, sat like a stone in his gut. But balance? How could he find balance when every part of him was screaming to let go? Dr. Lin's eyes softened, but only slightly. You need to find a way to ground yourself. You're a human being, Li Yong, not an animal. You need to learn to think again, not just feel. The instinct is there, but you're the one who has to decide whether it will rule you or whether you will learn to control it. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His body was already rebelling. Every muscle, every tendon, every nerve was thrumming with unnatural energy, begging to be used, to be freed. His skin felt too tight, his joints too rigid. It was like living in the body of someone else. Someone stronger, faster, but completely out of control. You can't hide from it, Dr. Lin continued, as if sensing his internal struggle. But you don't have to be consumed by it either. It's a part of you now, but it's not all of you. That's the key. You need to learn to think about what you're doing, not just react. The word stung, and the frustration began to churn in his chest. He didn't want to think. He didn't want to analyze. He just wanted to move. To run again. To tear through the streets, feel the wind, feel the freedom. I don't want to be this, Li Yong muttered, more to himself than to her. I didn't ask for any of this. I know, Dr. Lin said, her voice barely a whisper. But it's done now. And it's up to you how you live with it. Her words hung in the air long after she left. The silence in the apartment was deafening, a kind of heavy stillness that Li Yong could never have imagined before. It was a stillness that pressed in from all sides, as if the world had frozen in place, leaving him alone to deal with his new, impossible reality. His body, still vibrating with the animal energy coursing through it, felt alien to him. He was supposed to be human. But when he looked at his hands, he didn't recognize them. They were too strong, too capable, too alive in a way that didn't feel like anything he had ever known. The urge to move, to act, was constant, pushing against the edges of his mind. Every second, his body begged him to run again, to release the energy, to become something faster, something more. But this time, Li Yong closed his eyes. He focused on his breathing. Slow. Deep. In and out. The world didn't have to spin out of control, even if his body screamed for it. He could feel the sharpness of the air in his lungs. The rhythm of his heart. The tightness of his muscles. His senses were still there, still too alive, but this time, he didn't let them overwhelm him. He didn't let them take him. There was a moment of stillness, and for the first time in hours, Li Yong felt something like peace. It wasn't much. But it was enough. But even as he stood there, fighting the chaos within him, he knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over. And the animal inside him? It was still there, waiting. Li Yong stood motionless in the dim light of his apartment, his body humming with power he didn't understand. It was as if every cell in his body had been reprogrammed, retooled into something entirely foreign. His thoughts, once steady and rational, now felt fractured, pulled in different directions by the animal instincts clawing beneath the surface. Every time he tried to regain control, to force the chaos back into some semblance of order, the animal side of him only grew louder, more demanding. He had spent the last few days in a kind of fugue, half ignoring the reality of what he had become, trying to pretend that he could still function like a normal person. But normal didn't exist for him anymore. When he glanced at the mirror, the face staring back at him was still his, but the eyes, they were different. They were too sharp, too focused. His pupils were dilated, the way a predator's might be. His hands, calloused and trembling, were gripping the edge of the counter, as if holding on to some last shred of humanity. He'd tried to control it. He'd tried to push the instincts away, to think through every action before taking it, but it was impossible. He was flooded with them, and every time he thought he had a handle on things, they broke through. The world had become too bright, too loud. It was as if every sound, every movement around him was an invitation to act, to leap, to chase. But there was something else in him now, something sharper, more calculating. And it terrified him. Li Yong closed his eyes, breathing deeply in the silence. He could hear everything, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft rattle of the blinds in the window, the steady thrum of the city outside. But beneath it all, he could hear his own heartbeat. The fast, erratic beat of an animal in a cage. The instincts were too strong. They would take him, and there would be nothing left of the man who had walked into the lab a few weeks ago. Nothing but the beast. A sound pierced the quiet, the screech of metal on metal. It was distant, but sharp. His body responded before his mind even had time to register it. His head snapped toward the window, and his legs tensed, ready to spring. He saw it, a car, screeching to a halt in the street below. For a moment, all he saw was the red of its brake lights, the glow of the headlights reflecting off the rain-slicked pavement. But then, something else caught his attention. A man was stepping out of the car. No, it wasn't just a man, it was a figure. Someone moving with a kind of swagger, like they were in control of the world around them, like the city was their kingdom. Instinctively, Li Yong narrowed his eyes. Something about the way the man moved triggered a flare of something inside him. It wasn't just the energy in the air, or the fact that his senses were heightened. There was something else. He was watching the man like a hawk, his eyes following every shift in his posture, every flick of his hand. He could see the man's muscles flexing as he lit a cigarette. The way his fingers gripped the lighter. The tension in his shoulders as he stood there in the street, unaware of Li Yong's gaze. Li Yong's breath caught in his throat. There was a spark in him now, a wild hunger to move, to chase. His legs burned with the urge to run, to close the distance between himself and the man, to feel the thrill of the pursuit. The man took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly. His back was turned to the street, facing away from Li Yong's window. But that didn't matter. To Li Yong, it felt as if the whole world had slowed down. The car was still idling in the street. The sounds of the city had faded to a distant murmur. Everything but the man and the pull in his chest had vanished. This is it, he thought. This is what I've become. Without thinking, his feet were already in motion, the force of it carrying him toward the door, his body pushing through it before he even realized what he was doing. The air outside was colder than he expected, the night sharp against his skin. He barely noticed the chill as his legs pumped, faster, harder, each step longer than the last. His pulse was racing in his ears, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he moved with an unnatural speed, faster than any human should be able to run. The world blurred around him, but he didn't care. He was running on instinct now, and it felt like the only thing that mattered. He needed to catch up with the man. Needed to get closer. Needed to feel that surge of power, to feel the thrill of the chase. He wasn't sure how long he had been running. Minutes? Seconds? Time had lost all meaning. His legs were moving on their own, his body powered by the surge of animal energy that coursed through him like wildfire. He could feel the world around him stretching out as he closed the distance, felt the wind rushing past him, felt the ground beneath his feet as if it were nothing, and then, boom, he was there. The man had turned around, noticing him only when Li Yong was a few feet away. But even that didn't slow him down. He didn't stop running. He didn't think. Li Yong was on him in an instant, a blur of motion, and the man barely had time to react before Li Yong had grabbed him by the shoulders and shoved him back against the side of the car. The force of it rattled the vehicle. Li Yong's chest was heaving, his body burning with the energy that surged through him, demanding release. The man struggled against him, but it was useless. Li Yong was far too strong, far too fast. "Hey," the man shouted, his voice cracking with alarm. "What the hell are you doing?" Li Yong's mind was a mess of thoughts and sensations, but one thing was clear: the man was a threat, and Li Yong was going to stop him. The animal instincts had fully taken over, and Li Yong couldn't find a way to stop it. He wasn't thinking about consequences. He wasn't thinking about anything at all. He was acting. And that was enough, but then something broke through the haze. A voice. It wasn't the man's. It was his own. "Stop." It was a whisper at first, so faint he could hardly hear it. But then it grew, a force of will rising inside him. "Stop," he repeated, more forcefully this time. He shook his head as if to clear it. The grip on the man's shoulders loosened, and for the first time since this all started, Li Yong took a step back. The hunger, the drive, the desire to act, it was still there, pulsing beneath his skin. But he was fighting it. Fighting to remember that he wasn't just an animal. The man, still panting from the shock of being slammed against the car, pushed himself away, his hands shaking as he stared at Li Yong. You're crazy, man," he said, voice trembling with fear. "What the hell was that?" Li Yong didn't answer. He couldn't. His chest was tight, his breath ragged. He wanted to run, to chase, but he held still, focused on controlling the wild surge of power that had almost consumed him. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, forcing himself to calm down. When he opened his eyes again, the man was gone, his footsteps already fading into the night. The street was empty once more, the hum of the city surrounding him. The adrenaline began to wear off, and Li Yong collapsed against the side of the car, his body trembling with exhaustion. The rush of the chase had burned through him, leaving only the hollow ache of knowing he had been this close to losing everything, but for the first time, he understood what Dr. Lin had meant. He wasn't just a subject anymore. He was the experiment, and the experiment wasn't over. The battle wasn't over. And maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to win it.